So, like you mentioned before, how do you perceive the evolving global presence of Indian cinema, especially with Indian actors taking pivotal roles in international films like Triple R, garnering worldwide acclaim for their cinematography and music?
Uh, so I think core of your question, the evolving global presence of Indian cinema, particularly with Indian actors or cinematography and those kind of things like that. Triple R is actually, I think, a different category. No offense to the actors, but that was a kind of a director's movie. In fact, I would say people know. I don't think Westerners know any of the actors from Triple R, but they might know the name S.S. Rajamouli. And you have that, for example, sometimes people will know, Christopher Nolan and not necessarily know all the actors' names. There are sometimes directors become stars. But nevertheless, you do have the rise of Indian actors. I would say there have been attempts at this over the decades. People like Nandita Das, Nasruddin Shah, Irfan Khan have made forays into the West. But now you actually have more, let's say, mainstream kind of players. Priyanka Chopra is probably the best example. She's literally been a star of a TV show in America, Quantico. She's really back and forth, and you see more and more people playing this space. I have mixed feelings about it because I think it's quite transparent that Hollywood has a kind of a tokenism approach. So being instead of trying to do universal cinema, there's a very tempting kind of trap, which is to do international cinema, where you have a story and let's have one Chinese person and one Indian person and one Spanish person and one black person like that, and you have a cast of six people and it kind of represents the United Nations or something like that. And that is not necessarily a better movie. There is a case to be made for representation. That's a different conversation completely. But this kind of tokenism approach is not how Indian entertainment is going to advance on the global space. You're essentially still playing characters in Western stories with Western values, Western metaphysical looking, the way the West looks at the world, for example. Now, of course, there's a lot of overlap. We all share the same planet. Share the same stars, but I would say Indian sense of time is very different. There are certain things in Western storytelling that are very good because of a kind of a precision of time. Like there's kind of sometimes police procedurals where you have to go like a Sherlock Holmes. You have to go, minute little moments in time, split seconds, looking at the clues and things like that. That's a very kind of Western scientific, linear way of looking at the world and at storytelling. And those stories really excel. But maybe you have kind of stories where there's kind of a more timeless or kind of history echoes in the stories, where you can have a very kind of contemporary Indian movie, but Indian audiences will see the Mahabharata in it, they'll see the Ramayana, they'll make connections to myths and narratives of the past. Those are just different kinds of storytelling. So you're not going to get Indian storytelling on a global level just by having a couple Indians showing up in Western movies. You essentially have to make Indian stories more accessible to global audiences. And that means you don't just make them for your homegrown audience. You make them for audiences that you wouldn't normally make it for. That is to say, you make the movie true to the spirit of what you're doing here, but in a way that somebody in Nigeria could also enjoy it. That there's no reason with subtitling or dubbing that somebody in Nigeria couldn't appreciate your movie. And that will happen anyway. That will increasingly happen, and it'll go both ways. There will no doubt be, in the next 5 years, maybe 10 years, some movie out of Nollywood, which, hits a nerve and it's a universal, and somebody in Madhya Pradesh goes, yeah, I understand that movie. So that universal is the way that we kind of have to get it. And India has so many stories that it has a better chance of getting to the universal than almost any other country. America has had a lot of success for a very specific reason. America doesn't have history. America is a very short-term country in the history of the world. It's a very relatively new country. And we don't believe in history. We go to Silicon Valley and we say, we don't care what the past was. We're going to make our own future. There's a very American kind of view. There's a very kind of American mindset. So that's a very interesting thing, because if you have a mindset which is, I don't care about the past, I don't care about history, we're going to do it our way, well, then you can make new stories in film without being bogged down to the past. You don't rely on history, you create your history in films. And that's been one of the reasons that American cinema works, is because it's created a whole new myth. Instead of relying upon old myths, they've created the new myth. Now, the challenge here for India is, how do you take thousands of years of storytelling, and make it fresh, and not rely that, oh, my audience will get the connections to the past myths. How do you tell your stories in a way that, and someone who isn't familiar with Ramayana or Mahabharata or any of the other Puranas or anything like that, somebody who isn't familiar with it will understand your story nevertheless. And when India can do that without relying on a storytelling history, but using that as kind of, inspiration, then it will become increasingly a global player. Until then, it's still relying on its own domestic audience to understand its stories. And that's kind of a crutch instead of being, it's too often a crutch instead of being a strength to becoming more universal storytelling.